December 27th, 1942. Shortly after noon, the skies above Buna, New Guinea. Second Lieutenant Richard Bong pushes his twin-engine P-38 Lightning into a steep dive, the altimeter spinning backward as the jungle canopy rushes up to meet him. Below, a formation of Japanese fighters escorts bombers toward Allied positions. The other American pilots in his flight are hanging back, picking their angles, calculating deflection shots from safe distances. Richard Bong is doing something different, something the textbooks say is wrong. He is flying directly at the enemy, head-on, closing the distance at a combined speed of nearly 600 miles per hour. The other pilots watch in disbelief as this skinny farm boy from Wisconsin aims his fighter straight at a Mitsubishi Zero, the most feared aircraft in the Pacific. At this closing rate, he has perhaps 3 seconds to fire before collision. The margin for error is 0. The technique contradicts everything they learned in training. The instructors back at gunnery school had taught a different approach. Fire from distance, calculate deflection angles, lead your target by the proper amount, and let physics do the work. That was the smart way, the safe way, the way pilots survived long enough to become aces. These techniques had been refined over decades, tested in combat, validated by experts. But Richard Bong had a problem with that approach. He had convinced himself his gunnery skills were terrible. He missed too often at range, so he developed his own solution. Get so close you cannot miss. His fellow pilots called it reckless. They called it stupid. Some called it suicidal. A pilot who flies directly at enemy aircraft, closing to point-blank range before opening fire, is a pilot who will not last long in combat. Everyone knew that. Everyone except Richard Bong. The quiet kid from Poplar had looked at the conventional wisdom and decided it did not apply to him. What happens over the next 2 years will prove all of them wrong. This unassuming Wisconsin farm boy will shoot down 40 Japanese aircraft, more than any American pilot in history, a record that still stands today. He will fly through the debris of exploding enemy planes, once even colliding with a target. He will earn the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, and every major combat decoration the United States military can bestow. He will become America's ace of aces. And he will do it all by flying directly at the enemy, getting so close he could see the expressions on the faces of the men he was about to kill. Richard Ira Bong was born September 24, 1920, at St. Mary's Hospital in Superior, Wisconsin, a small city perched on the western tip of Lake Superior, where the waters stretched so far toward the horizon they looked like an ocean. The city had grown up around the timber and shipping industries that fed the appetite of a growing nation, a working-class town where men earned their livings with their hands and their backs. His father, Carl Bong, had emigrated from Sweden as a young boy, bringing with him the work ethic and quiet determination that defined Scandinavian culture. Carl had little formal education but possessed an innate understanding of the land and its rhythms. He settled on a small farm near the tiny community of Poplar, about 20 miles southeast of Superior, and set about building a life in the harsh northern climate. His mother, Dora Bryce, was American-born, of Scots-English descent, a woman who kept the household running while raising what would eventually become 9 children. Dick was the firstborn, and like all firstborn sons on a Wisconsin farm, he learned responsibility early. The Bong family farm in Poplar sat amid rolling hills and timber stands, surrounded by the pristine wilderness of northern Wisconsin. The population of Poplar barely reached 300 souls. Everybody knew everybody. The families gathered at church on Sundays, helped each other during harvest, and looked out for one another through the brutal winters that could drop temperatures well below 0 for weeks at a time. It was the kind of place that built tough people, people who understood that nature did not care about your complaints and that work was simply what you did to survive. Young Dick, as everyone called him, took to farm life the way most Wisconsin boys did. He drove tractors and farm equipment from an early age, developing an intuitive feel for machinery that would serve him well later. He learned to fix what broke, to improvise solutions when the right parts were not available, to understand how engines and gears and hydraulics worked together to accomplish tasks. He hunted and fished in the surrounding woods and streams, played baseball and basketball and hockey on school teams, sang in the church choir, and played clarinet in the marching band. He participated in 4-H, once planting an extensive windbreak of evergreen trees on the family farm to help his father protect the crops from the harsh Wisconsin winds. He was good at most things he tried, but never flashy about it. The neighbors would later describe him as a nice boy, polite, hard-working, nobody's idea of a future war hero. But something happened in 1928 that changed everything. President Calvin Coolidge, seeking escape from the pressures of Washington, established a summer White House in Superior. The president had fallen in love with the trout fishing on the famous Brule River, and he returned summer after summer to cast his lines in those cold northern waters. But even on vacation, a president cannot be completely isolated. Mail had to be delivered, communications maintained. Important documents required his signature. The machinery of government could not stop simply because its chief executive wanted to catch fish. So twice a day, military aircraft flew over the Bong family farm, carrying correspondence to and from the leader of the free world. These were not mighty bombers or sleek fighters. They were simple mail planes, workhorses of the sky. But to an 8-year-old boy on a Wisconsin farm where automobiles were still a novelty, they might as well have been spaceships. Dick Bong would run outside every time he heard the engines approaching, staring up at the sky, watching the aircraft grow from specks to shapes to machines, and then shrink again into the distance. His younger sisters remember the excitement that seized him whenever a plane appeared. Everyone would run outside, they recalled, yelling and pointing at the sky. But Dick watched differently. He watched like a boy who had found his calling, transfixed by the miracle of human flight passing overhead. From that moment forward, aviation consumed him. He built model airplanes obsessively, teaching himself the principles of aerodynamics through trial and error. He carved wooden propellers and stretched fabric over balsa frames, testing different designs to see which would fly the longest and straightest. He studied the aircraft in magazines and newspapers, memorizing specifications, learning the names of famous aviators, dreaming of the day he might climb into a cockpit himself. While other boys his age dreamed of becoming baseball players or cowboys, Dick Bong dreamed only of the sky. The farm boy from Poplar had fallen in love with flight. After graduating from Superior Central High School in 1938, Bong enrolled at Superior State Teachers College. The school was small, but offered something far more valuable than a teaching degree. A civilian pilot training program, sponsored by the federal government, had been established there. The program was designed to create a pool of trained pilots that could be called upon if America ever went to war. For Dick Bong, it was simply the fastest path to the sky. He took flying lessons in a Piper J3 Cub, a tiny fabric-covered trainer that bounced and swayed in the Wisconsin winds. The little yellow airplane was powered by a modest engine that produced barely enough thrust to lift itself and a single student into the air. But for Dick Bong, it was everything he had dreamed about since watching those mail planes pass over the farm. He earned his private pilot license after logging 36 hours of flight time, but he kept going, building experience, preparing for something he could not quite name but knew was coming. The clouds of war had been gathering over Europe since the mid-1930s. Hitler had risen to power in Germany. Japan was expanding aggressively throughout Asia. The newsreels that played before the picture shows at the local theatre told of countries invaded, cities bombed, populations displaced. Most Americans wanted nothing to do with another European war, but anyone paying attention could see that neutrality would not last forever. In early 1941, Dick Bong enlisted in the Army Air Corps Aviation Cadet Program. He wanted to fly military aircraft, the fastest and most powerful machines in the sky. He entered service at Wausau, Wisconsin, on May 29, 1941, and was sent to the Rankin Aeronautical Academy, a primary flight school near Tulare, California. There, he soloed in a Stearman biplane trainer on June 25th. The open cockpit trainer was a far cry from the sleek fighters he would eventually fly, but it taught the fundamentals of stick and rudder work that would keep him alive in combat. He took his basic flight training in a BT-13 at Gardner Field near Taft, California, then moved to Luke Field near Phoenix, Arizona, for advanced single-engine pilot training in an AT-6 Texan. One of his gunnery instructors at Luke was a young captain named Barry Goldwater, who would later become a United States Senator and presidential candidate. Goldwater remembered Bong as a very bright student, naturally gifted in the air, already showing exceptional talent as a pilot. But the most telling observation came from a P-38 Czech pilot who flew with Bong during his training. He said Bong was the finest natural pilot he had ever met. There was no way to keep Bong from getting on his tail, even though he was flying an AT-6, a very slow airplane. The Czech pilot was flying a more powerful aircraft and had more experience, but it did not matter. Bong seemed to anticipate every move, every turn, every attempt to shake him loose. It was as if he could read his opponent's mind. On January 9, 1942, 1 month after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor thrust America into war, Richard Bong received his pilot wings and a commission as a second lieutenant in the Army Air Forces. The nation was reeling from the shock of December 7th. The Pacific Fleet lay shattered at Pearl Harbor. The Philippines were under siege. Wake Island had fallen. Americans were dying on battlefields and beachheads across the Pacific, and the enemy seemed unstoppable. Bong was assigned as a gunnery instructor at Luke Field, his skills so impressive that his commanding officers wanted to keep him stateside to train other pilots. Teaching the next generation of combat aviators was important work, vital to the war effort. But Bong had not joined the army to teach in Arizona. He wanted to fight. He wanted to put his skills to the test against the enemy who had attacked his country. Every day he spent in the training command was a day he was not in combat. In May of 1942, Bong was transferred to Hamilton Field near San Francisco to train on the aircraft that would define his combat career. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was unlike anything else in the American arsenal. Twin Allison engines mounted on twin booms generated over 2,800 horsepower combined, pushing the aircraft to speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. A central nacelle housed the pilot and an unprecedented concentration of firepower. 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose, all firing straight ahead. No convergence issues, no complex calculations for crossing fire. Point the aircraft at the target, press the trigger, and everything went exactly where you were looking. The P-38 had been developed in response to a 1937 specification calling for a high-altitude interceptor with heavy armament. Designed by a team led by the legendary Kelly Johnson, it represented a radical departure from conventional single-engine fighter design. The twin-boom configuration solved several engineering problems simultaneously, providing space for the turbo superchargers that allowed the aircraft to perform at high altitude while giving the pilot exceptional visibility. The nose-mounted armament eliminated the convergence issues that plagued wing-mounted guns, where bullets from opposite sides of the aircraft had to be aimed to cross at a specific distance. For a pilot who planned to get as close as possible before shooting, the P-38 was perfect. The concentrated firepower would devastate any target caught in its sights. The speed and climb rate would allow a pilot to dictate the terms of engagement, choosing when to fight and when to disengage. The range, with external fuel tanks, exceeded 2,000 miles, allowing operations deep into enemy territory. Dick Bong had found his weapon. But Dick Bong was not just talented. He was also young, and young pilots sometimes do foolish things. At Hamilton Field, he developed a reputation for daring, bordering on reckless stunts. He buzzed the house of a fellow pilot who had just gotten married, rattling windows and terrifying the bride. He flew his P-38 at low level down San Francisco's Market Street, reportedly blowing laundry off clotheslines and waving at astonished office workers through their windows. He was cited for flying a loop around the center span of the Golden Gate Bridge, though he always denied actually going under the bridge itself. The pranks caught the attention of General George C. Kenney, commander of the 4th Air Force. Kenney called Bong into his office and chewed him out thoroughly. The young lieutenant had violated regulations, endangered civilians, and risked a valuable aircraft on senseless stunts. But then Kenney said something that would prove prophetic. "If you didn't want to fly down Market Street, I wouldn't want you in my Air Force. But you're not to do it anymore, and I mean what I say." As punishment, Kenney ordered Bong to visit the Oakland woman whose laundry he had scattered and help her hang it back on the line. The incident might have ended Bong's career before it began. He was grounded while the rest of his unit shipped out to England. But Kenney had seen something in this wild young pilot, something that could not be taught. When Kenney was assigned to take command of the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific in September 1942, he handpicked 50 of the best P-38 pilots he knew to join him. Richard Bong was one of them. Bong arrived in Australia in late September, transported across the Pacific aboard a B-24 Liberator via Hawaii. He was assigned to the 9th Fighter Squadron of the 49th Fighter Group, known as the Flying Knights. The unit had earned fame defending Darwin against Japanese air raids earlier that year, but the squadron was still transitioning from P-40 Warhawks to P-38 Lightnings, and the new aircraft were slow to arrive. Rather than waste Bong's talents, Kenny temporarily attached him to the 39th Fighter Squadron, 35th Fighter Group, which already had P-38 seconds operating out of Port Moresby, New Guinea. It was there that Bong met Captain Thomas Lynch, a cool-headed Pennsylvania pilot who had already scored several victories. Lynch recognized Bong's raw talent and took him under his wing, teaching him the tactical realities of Pacific air combat. The Japanese were not like the Germans the Americans would face over Europe. Their aircraft, particularly the legendary Mitsubishi A-6M0, were lighter and more maneuverable. They could turn inside any American fighter in a dogfight. The key to beating them was speed and altitude. Never try to outturn a Zero. Use the P-38's superior speed to dive, attack, and climb away before the enemy could respond. But Bong developed his own addition to this doctrine. He noticed that his accuracy was mediocre at long range. The deflection shooting that worked for other pilots seemed to fail him. His bullets went wide, his targets escaped, so he started closing the distance. If he could not hit them at 300 yards, he would hit them at 100 yards, at 50 yards. At ranges so close, his aircraft would shake from the concussion of exploding enemy planes. Dick Bong loved flying, and he loved the P-38. The aircraft suited his aggressive style perfectly. He would later describe his combat technique as swooping down on his targets and blasting them at dangerously close range, then pulling up fast. It was not elegant. It was not what the textbooks recommended. But it worked. On December 27th, 1942, Bong finally got his chance at the enemy. Flying over Buna with the 39th Squadron, he engaged Japanese aircraft escorting bombers attacking Allied positions. In the swirling dogfight that followed, Bong shot down a Mitsubishi Zero and a Nakajima Oscar, 2 kills in his first combat. He was awarded the Silver Star for his actions that day. The other pilots noticed how close he had gotten before opening fire. They shook their heads and predicted he would not last long flying that way. But Bong had felt something in that first engagement, a confirmation that his instincts were right. Getting close worked. The enemy aircraft had exploded almost before he realized he had hit them. The technique the instructors called reckless had produced 2 kills on his first day of combat. 2 weeks later, on January 7th and 8th, 1943, Bong scored 3 more victories during attacks on a Japanese convoy, bringing reinforcements to New Guinea. On the 8th, while escorting a bomber mission, he and 7 fellow pilots engaged an estimated 20 enemy fighters. The distinguished flying cross he earned for that action described him shooting down an enemy aircraft with a long burst from 200 yards away. For most pilots, that was close. For Bong, it was only the beginning. In March, American and Australian forces attacked Japanese transport ships and destroyers, carrying nearly 7,000 reinforcements to New Guinea in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Bong was in the thick of it, shooting down a Zero as American aircraft devastated the convoy. 8 transports and 4 destroyers were sunk, thousands of Japanese soldiers drowned, and the enemy's attempt to reinforce their positions ended in catastrophe. It was a devastating defeat for Japan and a propaganda victory for the Allies. By April of 1943, Bong had 10 confirmed victories, making him a double ace. During the entire war, only 5% of fighter pilots would ever achieve ace status with 5 kills. Bong had doubled that number in just 4 months of combat. But it was on July 26 that he demonstrated what he was truly capable of. Over Lae, New Guinea, Bong spotted a formation of 20 Japanese fighters. He was leading just 10 P-38 seconds against those odds. Without hesitation, he led his flight into the attack, personally shooting down 2 enemy aircraft. When 15 more Japanese planes arrived as reinforcements, Bong ignored the overwhelming numbers and pressed the assault, downing 2 more. His flight of 10 destroyed 11 enemy aircraft without losing a single American pilot. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism. By now, the other pilots were beginning to understand what made Dick Bong different. He was not reckless. He was calculated. He understood the P-38's strengths and limitations better than perhaps any pilot in the Pacific. He never pushed the aircraft beyond what it could do. He analyzed every situation before committing to attack, and most importantly, he felt no shame in breaking off an engagement when the odds turned against him. He was aggressive, but never foolish. The combination was devastating to the enemy, and he was getting closer and closer to his targets. Bong would later say he considered his gunnery skills to be poor, perhaps the worst in the Army Air Force. This was almost certainly false modesty. Estimates of his actual hit rate approached 91%, phenomenally high by any standard, but his belief in his own inadequacy drove him to develop tactics that other pilots considered insane. He would dive on enemy formations and pull up directly behind a target, closing to distances where he could not possibly miss. On several occasions, he flew through the debris of aircraft he had just destroyed. Once, he actually collided with an enemy plane, claiming it as a probable victory. In November of 1943, with 21 confirmed kills, Bong was granted leave to return home. He had become a national hero, and the Army Air Forces wanted to use him for morale and war bond promotions. He hated the publicity tours. "Dragged around the country," he told a fellow pilot, "worse than having a 0 on your tail." The shy farm boy from Poplar was deeply uncomfortable with the attention, the speeches, and the crowds of strangers wanting to shake his hand. But something good came from that leave. At a homecoming dance at Superior State Teachers College, Bong met a young woman named Marjorie Vattendahl. She was pretty and vivacious, everything the quiet pilot was not. They began dating, and Dick fell hard for the college girl from his hometown. For the first time since those mail planes flew over the farm, something other than flying had captured his heart. When he returned to the Pacific in January 1944, he renamed his P-38. The new aircraft bore a large photograph of Marjorie on its nose, along with the name that would become famous throughout the theatre, Marge. Dick would later joke that Marge was the most shot-at girl in the South Pacific. The race for Rickenbacker's record was heating up. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, America's ace of aces from the First World War, had shot down 26 enemy aircraft during that conflict. His record had stood for more than 25 years, a seemingly insurmountable achievement. When Rickenbacker visited the Pacific in 1942 to boost morale among the American forces, General Kenny seized the opportunity to motivate his pilots. He offered a case of scotch to the first man to beat Rickenbacker's record. The old ace matched the offer. Suddenly, the competition was on. The race captivated the American public. Newspapers back home tracked the progress of the leading aces like sports statistics: Dick Bong, Tommy Maguire, Gerald Johnson, Neil Kirby, Tom Lynch. These names became as familiar to Americans as their favorite baseball players. But unlike sports, the stakes in this competition were life and death. On April 12, 1944, Captain Richard Bong shot down his 26th and 27th Japanese aircraft over Hollandia, New Guinea. He had broken Rickenbacker's record. Within days, he was promoted to major. Rickenbacker announced he was making good on his promise. A case of scotch was on its way to the Pacific. But General MacArthur's headquarters intervened. The general had the highest admiration for the major's skill and gallantry, a spokesman said, but felt that the recent promotion from captain to major was the proper soldierly reward. There would be no whiskey for Major Bong. The Women's Christian Temperance Union rejoiced at MacArthur's decision, praising the general for becoming a moral leader. Now a staff officer with a roving commission, Bong was no longer required to fly combat missions. He was assigned as an advanced gunnery instructor, teaching other pilots the tactics that had made him so deadly. But the orders said he could not seek combat. They did not say he could not defend himself. Bong found ways to bend the rules. He volunteered for missions constantly. And somehow, enemy aircraft kept appearing in his path. The rivalry with Major Tommy Maguire intensified through the fall of 1944. Maguire, a brilliant but abrasive pilot from New Jersey who had been raised in Florida, was closing in on Bong's score. The two men could not have been more different. Bong was quiet, modest, and almost invisible among his fellow pilots. Maguire was aggressive, prickly, obsessed with kills, always letting everyone know exactly how good he was. They flew together sometimes, and the tension was palpable. Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, flew several combat missions as a civilian contractor during this period, sometimes as Maguire's wingman. Fellow pilots recalled Maguire ordering Lindbergh around like a servant, telling him to run errands. The famous pilot seemed to take it in stride, recognizing Maguire's skill even if his personality grated. On one December mission over Ormoc Bay, Bong suddenly broke formation without warning to chase down and destroy a Japanese bomber. He had spotted the target with his sharp eyes before anyone else and went after it without calling out the contact. His fellow pilots seethed. He had violated the most basic and inviolable law of air combat in the Pacific theater: teamwork. He had abandoned his formation, failed to communicate, and went off hunting on his own. Some called him selfish, obsessed with staying ahead of Maguire. But the brass saw only results. On December 12, 1944, at Tacloban Airfield on Leyte in the Philippines, Major Richard Bong stood at attention while General Douglas MacArthur placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. MacArthur cast aside his prepared remarks and spoke from the heart. Major Richard Ira Bong, who has ruled the air from New Guinea to the Philippines, I now induct you into the Society of the Bravest of the Brave, the wearers of the Congressional Medal of Honor of the United States. The Medal of Honor citation praised Bong for his actions between October 10th and November 15th, 1944. Though assigned to duty as a gunnery instructor and neither required nor expected to perform combat duty, the citation read, Major Bong voluntarily and at his own urgent request engaged in repeated combat missions, including unusually hazardous sorties over Balikpapan, Borneo, and in the Leyte area of the Philippines. His aggressiveness and daring resulted in his shooting down 8 enemy airplanes during this period. By December 17th, Bong had raised his total to 40 confirmed aerial victories. It was a record no American had ever achieved and one that still stands today. General Kenny had seen enough. With over 200 combat missions and more than 500 combat hours behind him, America's ace of aces had contributed more than his share to the war effort. Kenny ordered Bong home, telling him to marry Marjorie and start thinking about raising a lot of tow-headed Swedes. Maguire, meanwhile, was grounded by Kenny's orders. The general could not send Bong back to the States as the top ace only to have Maguire snatch the crown from his head. Maguire chafed at the restriction, flying unauthorized missions trying to close the 2-kill gap between his 38 and Bong's 40. On January 7th, 1945, Maguire led a 4-plane sweep over Negros Island in the Philippines. Desperately wanting those final victories, he made a fatal mistake during a low-altitude engagement with a Japanese fighter. His P-38 stalled and crashed into the jungle below. Tommy Maguire died still chasing Bong's record. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for actions on December 25th and 26th, when he had shot down 7 enemy aircraft in 2 days. On February 10th, 1945, Dick Bong married Marjorie Vattendahl at Concordia Lutheran Church in Superior. 1,200 guests attended the ceremony. The international press covered the event. America's ace of aces had come home a hero. They honeymooned in California, visiting Hollywood and Sequoia National Park, enjoying the kind of normal life that had seemed impossible just months before. For a few brief weeks, Dick and Marge were simply newlyweds, not a war hero and his bride. After the honeymoon, Bong reported to Wright Field in Ohio to work as a test pilot. The Army Air Forces was developing a revolutionary new aircraft, the Lockheed P-38 Shooting Star. It was America's first operational jet fighter, capable of speeds approaching 600 miles per hour, powered by a turbojet engine rather than a propeller. The new technology promised to revolutionize aviation. Bong was fascinated. In June, he was assigned to Lockheed's plant in Burbank, California, as an acceptance test pilot for the P-80. August 6, 1945, the day the world changed. Half a world away in Japan, the B-29 bomber, Enola Gay, dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, killing tens of thousands in an instant and ushering in the nuclear age. The war that had consumed Dick Bong's youth was finally nearing its end. Japan could not hold out much longer. He would not have to go back into combat. He could look forward to a life with Marjorie, maybe those tow-headed Swedish kids Kenny had joked about. That afternoon, at approximately 2:30, Major Richard Bong climbed into P-80, a number 44-85048, at Lockheed Air Terminal for a routine acceptance flight. He had logged 12 previous flights in the jet, accumulating about 4 hours and 15 minutes of experience in the type. The P-80 was a temperamental aircraft, still working through the teething troubles that plagued all new designs. Shortly after takeoff, the primary fuel pump failed. The shooting star had a backup system, an auxiliary pump designated I-16 that had been added after an earlier fatal crash. Pilots were supposed to switch to the backup if the primary pump failed. For reasons that remain disputed to this day, Bong did not activate the auxiliary pump. Captain Ray Crawford, another test pilot who flew that day, later recalled that Bong had mentioned forgetting to turn on the I-16 pump on an earlier flight. Some believe he repeated that mistake. Others suggest he was unable to reach the switch. His brother Carl, who later wrote his biography, questioned whether Bong could have made such an error so soon after mentioning it to another pilot. The jet rolled upside down. Bong ejected from the stricken aircraft, but he was too low. His parachute never had time to fully deploy. Witnesses reported that he cleared the aircraft but was too close to the ground for the chute to save him. The P-80 crashed into a narrow field at the intersection of Oxnard Street and Satsuma Avenue in North Hollywood and exploded. Major Richard Ira Bong, America's ace of aces, the finest combat pilot the nation had ever produced, was dead at the age of 24. He had been married for less than 6 months. The news of his death shared front pages across America with the reports from Hiroshima. Some newspapers gave Bong's story more prominent placement than the atomic bomb. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times all carried front-page stories about the ace's death alongside the reports of the most destructive weapon ever unleashed. General Kenny, who had mentored Bong since those early days at Hamilton Field, received the news while preparing to depart for Manila. He later wrote that he stopped thinking about the bomb that had wiped out Hiroshima that morning, stopped speculating about the entry of Russia into the war, even stopped thinking about the imminent Japanese surrender. The whole 5th Air Force felt the same, that we had lost a loved one. We not only loved him, we boasted about him. We were proud of him. Richard Bong was buried on August 8, 1945, in the Poplar Cemetery, not far from the farm where he had grown up watching mail planes fly overhead. Thousands lined the funeral route to pay their respects. His widow, Marjorie, just 21 years old, would eventually remarry and raise a family in California. She died of cancer in September 2003 and was buried beside Dick in Poplar, together forever in the Wisconsin soil where his dreams of flight first took root. The legacy of America's ace of aces endures in ways both monumental and intimate. His hometown of Poplar maintains a memorial with a P-38 Lightning mounted on pylons. The Richard I. Bong Veterans Historical Center opened in Superior in 2002, housing a museum dedicated to his memory and featuring a restored P-38 painted to resemble Marge. Bridges, airports, streets, and military installations across the country and around the world bear his name. The Richard I. Bong Memorial Bridge spans the harbor between Superior and Duluth. The Richard I. Bong Airport serves his hometown. The road leading to the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, is named for him. What does the story of Richard Bong tell us about courage, about skill, about what one person can accomplish when they trust their own instincts against conventional wisdom? It tells us that sometimes the experts are wrong. The gunnery instructors taught pilots to keep their distance, to calculate angles, to fight smart and safe. Dick Bong listened to those lessons and then developed his own approach, one that terrified his instructors and astonished his fellow pilots. He got close. He got impossibly close. And he became the most successful fighter pilot in American history. It tells us that quiet determination often outperforms flashy confidence. Bong was not the swaggering ace of Hollywood imagination. He was a shy farm boy who hated publicity and deflected praise with characteristic modesty. When asked how he became so good at shooting down enemy aircraft, he shrugged and said he was just lucky. A lot of Japanese happened to get in my way. The reality was far more complex. He was a student of air combat who analyzed every engagement and refined his tactics constantly, but he never needed to boast about it. It tells us that natural talent combined with relentless practice can achieve extraordinary results. Barry Goldwater saw it during training. The P-38 Czech pilot saw it at Hamilton Field. George Kenney saw it when he selected Bong for the Pacific. There was something about the way Dick Bong flew an airplane that could not be taught. He became one with the machine in a way that made other pilots seem like passengers in their own aircraft. Most of all, it tells us that courage is not the absence of fear but the determination to act despite it. Every time Dick Bong pointed his P-38 directly at an enemy fighter and held course while the distance closed at 600 miles per hour, he knew what could happen if his timing was off by a fraction of a second. Every time he flew through the debris of an exploding aircraft, he understood the risks. He did it anyway, 40 times, because he had found a method that worked, and he trusted it more than he trusted the textbooks. The pilots who mocked his head-on attacks learned to respect them. The instructors who called his tactics reckless watched him become the most decorated pilot in American history. The military establishment that questioned whether such an approach could work saw him prove, mission after mission, that getting close was not suicide, it was victory. August 6, 1945. A narrow field in North Hollywood. America's ace of aces falls from the sky one final time. He was 24 years old. He had shot down 40 enemy aircraft, a record that stands to this day. He had earned the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 7 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and 15 Air Medals. He had married his sweetheart and dreamed of a peaceful future. He had survived hundreds of hours of combat against the most dangerous enemy pilots in the world. And in the end, it was not a Japanese Zero that brought him down. It was a fuel pump in a jet that was supposed to carry America into a new age of aviation. The ace, who had flown through explosions and debris and point-blank gunfire, died on a routine test flight over his own country. But what he left behind endures. In Poplar, Wisconsin, children still learn about the local boy who watched mail planes and dreamed of touching the sky. In Superior, veterans gather at the center that bears his name to honor all who served. In flight schools around the world, instructors study his tactics, teaching a new generation that sometimes the best shot is the one you take at point-blank range. Richard Bong did not live to see the peaceful world his generation fought to create, but he helped make that world possible, 40 victories at a time, flying directly at the enemy while others held back. They called his tactics stupid. They called him reckless. They said he would never survive flying that way. He shot down 40 Japanese planes and became America's ace of aces. And nobody who flew with him ever forgot the quiet farm boy from Wisconsin who rewrote the rules of aerial combat by doing what everyone said was impossible.